You watch as your good intentions crumble under pressure while others advance through calculated moves you're too principled to make. Every day you hold yourself to high moral standards, yet somehow you remain powerless, while those who bend the rules shape the world around you, leaving you wondering if virtue is actually a weakness in disguise. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I spent my life studying the brutal mechanics of power in Renaissance Italy, where moral weakness meant political death and national destruction. What I discovered about the relationship between virtue and strength will transform how you understand moral courage, not as naive idealism, but as the strategic wisdom to know when principles serve power and when they surrender it. The same insights that helped princes navigate treacherous courts can help you navigate modern challenges where moral clarity becomes your greatest competitive advantage. Whether you're managing office politics or life decisions, understanding true virtue versus moral weakness will give you the framework to act with both integrity and effectiveness. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Renaissance wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of principled power. Let me take you back to 1498, when I was a young man of 29, burning with idealistic fire and absolutely certain that virtue would triumph over vice. I had just been appointed second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, and I believed, God, help me, how naive I was, that good intentions and moral purity would be enough to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics. My commission papers still bore the seal of our republic, and I carried them like a sacred trust. I thought I understood power because I had read Cicero and studied the ancient Romans. I believed that if we simply governed with justice and virtue, our enemies would respect us, our allies would remain loyal, and Florence would prosper. What I didn't understand was that while I was playing by the rules of moral philosophy, everyone else was playing by the rules of survival. My first diplomatic mission shattered every illusion I held about the relationship between virtue and power. I was sent to observe Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, who was cutting a bloody path through central Italy. I expected to meet a monster, a man corrupted by evil ambitions. Instead, I found something far more disturbing, a leader who was achieving exactly what Florence needed to achieve, but through methods that would have made our republic's moralists faint with horror. Borgia received me in his camp, and I watched him work. When subordinates failed him, he didn't give them second chances or gentle corrections. He eliminated them swiftly and publicly. When cities resisted his advance, he didn't negotiate endlessly or seek moral authority. He besieged them with such ferocity that neighboring cities surrendered rather than face the same fate. When allies proved unreliable, he didn't appeal to their better nature. He made them more afraid of betraying him than of any other consequence. The most chilling moment came when I witnessed him deal with a rebellion in one of his conquered territories. The rebels had counted on his Christian mercy and his desire to be seen as a just ruler. They miscalculated fatally. Borgia crushed the rebellion with such calculated brutality that no one in his territories ever rebelled again. Peace returned, commerce flourished, and the people lived better lives under his harsh but effective rule than they had under their previous virtuous leaders who had been too weak to maintain order. I returned to Florence with a terrible realization. Our republic's commitment to moral purity was actually a form of moral weakness that was destroying us. While we debated ethics in our councils, our enemies were seizing our trade routes. While we tried to govern through consensus and virtue, stronger powers were carving up Italy around us. Our goodness was not making us good. It was making us victims. The evidence was everywhere once I began to see it clearly. Venice had grown powerful not through virtue, but through ruthless commercial cunning. The Pope himself wielded temporal power through means that would shock a common criminal. The French were winning battles in Italy not because they were more virtuous, but because they understood that power flows to those willing to seize it decisively. Most painfully, I began to understand that our enemies didn't respect our virtue. They exploited it. They knew we would honor treaties they had no intention of keeping. They knew we would show mercy they would never reciprocate. They knew we would hesitate at crucial moments while they acted without moral anguish. Our virtue had become their weapon against us. This was my awakening. Moral weakness isn't being evil. It's being good in ways that enable evil to flourish. It's choosing purity over effectiveness when effectiveness would serve justice better. It's letting your desire to feel virtuous override your responsibility to achieve virtuous outcomes. The morning they came for me, I was at my desk writing diplomatic correspondence, still believing that reason and virtue would protect me from the political storm that was brewing. The Medici family had returned to Florence with papal backing, and our republic was crumbling. I had served the republic faithfully for 14 years, and I thought that loyalty would count for something. I was about to learn the hardest lesson of my life about the difference between moral weakness and moral strength. The soldiers who arrested me weren't cruel men, just professionals doing their job. They bound my hands and led me through the streets where I had once walked as a respected official. The citizens I had served averted their eyes. The colleagues who had debated virtue with me in our councils were nowhere to be seen. This was my first taste of how quickly virtue without power becomes irrelevant. In the prison cell, they used the strappado on me, hanging me by my wrists with my arms twisted behind my back until the pain became a living thing that consumed every thought. Between sessions, they would lower me and ask about conspiracies against the Medici. I told them the truth. There were no conspiracies, at least none that I was part of. But truth, I learned, is a luxury that only the powerful can afford. During those long nights in the cell, scratching notes into the stone walls with my fingernails, I was forced to confront the fundamental flaw in my thinking. I had believed that being right would protect me. I had believed that serving justice would earn me justice in return. I had believed that virtue created a kind of magical shield around those who practiced it. The strappado taught me otherwise. The guards weren't torturing me because they thought I was evil. They were torturing me because they couldn't afford to let someone with my knowledge and connections remain free. They weren't acting from malice, but from perfectly rational fear. And my virtue, my innocence, my years of faithful service meant absolutely nothing in the face of their practical concerns about power and security. This was when I began to understand what I would later call the fundamental paradox of moral life. Good intentions, without the power to enforce them, are not just useless, they're often harmful. My commitment to playing by the rules had left me helpless when others abandoned those rules. My refusal to think strategically about power had made me a liability to everyone, including the cause of justice I claimed to serve. In that cell, I realized that my previous understanding of virtue was actually a form of selfishness. I had been more concerned with keeping my own hands clean than with achieving outcomes that would actually benefit the people I claimed to serve. I had chosen moral purity over moral effectiveness, and the result wasn't virtue. It was irrelevance. The revelation that changed everything came during my 6th week of imprisonment. A guard, not unkindly, told me that my former colleagues in the Republican government were distancing themselves from me to save their own positions. They weren't evil men. They were practical men who understood what I had failed to grasp, that martyrdom serves no one if it accomplishes nothing. I began to see that what I had called virtue was often just fear disguised as principle. I had been afraid to get my hands dirty, afraid to make hard choices, afraid to be seen as anything less than perfectly moral. This fear had made me weak, and my weakness had made me useless to the very causes I claimed to champion. When they finally released me into exile, I was a different man. I had learned that the world is not divided between good people and bad people, but between effective people and ineffective people. The Medici weren't evil for wanting power. They were realistic about what power required. I had been weak for thinking that wanting good outcomes was the same as achieving them. My exile became my education. Away from the comfortable illusions of Republican idealism, I was forced to see politics as it really was. A contest between competing forces where the most effective strategies win, regardless of their moral pedigree. The question wasn't whether this was right or wrong. The question was whether I would continue to be irrelevant or learn to be effective. This was when I began to develop what would become my life's work, understanding how moral strength differs from moral weakness, and how truly virtuous people must sometimes use methods that make them uncomfortable in order to serve the greater good. The torture had broken my body temporarily, but it had freed my mind permanently from the prison of ineffective virtue. After my release from prison, I spent months in my villa at Sant'Andrea, and it was there, in a letter to my friend Francesco Vetteri, that I first articulated what would become the cornerstone of my philosophy, the true nature of moral weakness. Most people, I realized, have it completely backwards. They think moral weakness means being selfish or cruel or dishonest. But I had discovered something far more dangerous. Moral weakness is often disguised as virtue itself. Let me be precise about this, because this distinction will determine whether you live a life of effective service or ineffective self-righteousness. Moral weakness is not the absence of good intentions. It's the presence of good intentions without the courage, wisdom, or skill to make them effective in the real world. It's wanting to do good more than you want to accomplish good. I had seen this pattern everywhere in Italian politics, and I was beginning to see it in my own life. The most morally weak leaders weren't the obviously corrupt ones. Those were actually dangerous and therefore had to be taken seriously. The morally weak ones were those who crippled themselves and their causes through an obsession with moral purity that made them ineffective in the very situations where effectiveness was most needed. Consider what I observed about the relationship between Christian virtue and political necessity. The church taught that pride was a sin, yet I watched successful leaders who needed pride to maintain the confidence their followers required. The church taught that anger was a sin, yet I saw that strategic anger could prevent greater injustices than patient tolerance. The church taught that deception was evil, yet I witnessed how strategic ambiguity could prevent wars that honesty would provoke. The moral weakness wasn't in the leaders who understood these realities. It was in those who preferred to feel virtuous rather than be effective. They would rather lose with clean hands than win with complicated ones. They would rather be admired for their principles than accomplish the goals those principles were supposed to serve. I began to understand that there are two kinds of virtue: virtue as personal purity and virtue as effective service to the good. The first kind makes you feel better about yourself. The second kind actually makes the world better. Moral weakness is choosing the first when circumstances demand the second. Here's what I discovered about how moral weakness actually manifests in daily life. It shows up when you avoid necessary confrontations because you want to be liked rather than because you want to solve problems. It appears when you follow rules that no longer serve their purpose simply because breaking them would feel wrong. It emerges when you let perfect become the enemy of good, and when you choose symbolic gestures over substantive action. I watched this pattern destroy the Florentine Republic. Our leaders were so concerned with being seen as virtuous that they became paralyzed when virtue required them to act in ways that looked harsh or calculating. They would rather lose a war virtuously than win it through means that might be criticized. They preferred to be praised for their intentions rather than judged by their results. But here's the crucial insight that changed how I understood morality. Forever, when good people render themselves ineffective through moral weakness, they don't just fail to do good, they actively enable evil to flourish. Every time a moral leader chooses purity over effectiveness, they cede ground to leaders who have no such qualms. The most morally weak thing you can do is to let your desire to feel righteous override your responsibility to achieve righteous outcomes. It's to care more about your reputation for goodness than about actually accomplishing good. It's to mistake the comfort of moral superiority for the hard work of moral leadership. True moral strength, I realized, requires the courage to get your hands dirty in service of clean outcomes. It requires the wisdom to distinguish between principles that should never be compromised and tactics that must be adapted to circumstances. It requires the humility to care more about results than about how those results make you feel about yourself. This doesn't mean abandoning ethics. It means upgrading from childish ethics to adult ethics. Childish ethics says, never lie. Adult ethics says, lie when lying serves truth better than honesty would. Childish ethics says, always be nice. Adult ethics says, be as kind as you can while being as effective as you must. The letter I wrote to Vittori that summer contained this realization: moral weakness is the luxury of those who can afford to be irrelevant. When you have real responsibility for real outcomes affecting real people, moral weakness becomes a form of cruelty, the cruelty of valuing your own moral comfort over other people's welfare. In my study, I kept ancient Roman coins depicting various emperors, and one day, while examining a coin showing Marcus Aurelius, I had the insight that would become perhaps my most famous principle. A leader must be both lion and fox. The coin showed the emperor, in profile, and I imagined how he had needed both the lion's strength and the fox's cunning to maintain the empire. This image crystallized my understanding of why moral weakness often stems from one-dimensional thinking. Most people, I realized, fall into moral weakness because they believe they must choose between strength and intelligence, between force and cunning, between being feared and being clever. They think virtue means being consistently one thing, always honest, always gentle, always direct. But the world is too complex for such simplicity, and this simplicity becomes a form of moral weakness because it renders you ineffective when circumstances require flexibility. Let me explain what I mean by the lion and the fox, because mastering this principle will free you from the moral weakness of rigid thinking. The lion represents direct force, the willingness to confront obstacles head-on, to use your power openly, to be unmistakably strong when strength is what the situation demands. The fox represents cunning intelligence, the ability to outmaneuver opponents, to achieve your goals through strategy rather than force, to be subtle when subtlety serves your purposes better than directness. The moral weakness I observed in so many leaders was their inability to move fluidly between these two modes. They were either all lion or all fox, and this limitation made them predictable and therefore defeatable. I watched princes who were all lion, who thought that strength meant never compromising, never being strategic, never adapting their approach to circumstances. These men were impressive in their consistency, but they were also limited in their effectiveness. They would charge straight at every problem with the same tactics, and clever opponents would simply step aside and let their momentum carry them into traps. Conversely, I observed leaders who were all fox, who thought that intelligence meant never using direct force, never being confrontational, never making anyone uncomfortable. These leaders could be incredibly sophisticated in their maneuvering, but when situations arose that could only be resolved through direct action, they became paralyzed by their own cleverness. The truly dangerous leaders, the ones I learned to respect and fear, were those who could be either lion or fox as circumstances required. When negotiation would serve their goals, they negotiated brilliantly. When force was necessary, they applied it without hesitation. When the situation called for transparency, they were refreshingly direct. When it called for strategic ambiguity, they became masters of misdirection. Here's how this applies to the moral weakness that may be limiting your own effectiveness. If you're always the lion, people learn to avoid direct confrontation with you and find ways to undermine you indirectly. If you're always the fox, people learn not to take you seriously when serious situations arise. Either approach, used exclusively, becomes a weakness that others can exploit. The moral strength of the lion-fox principle lies in its service to effectiveness rather than ego. You don't choose to be direct because you enjoy confrontation. You choose directness when it will achieve your goals better than subtlety would. You don't choose cunning because you enjoy being clever. You choose strategy when it will serve your purposes better than force would. I learned this principle by studying Cesare Borgia's most successful campaign. When he needed to secure loyalty from his mercenary captains, he invited them to a feast and had them strangled. Pure lion, eliminating a threat through direct action. But when he needed to take the city of Faenza, he spent months in careful negotiation and strategic positioning rather than assault. Pure fox, achieving his goal through patience and cunning rather than force. The moral weakness that most people fall into is believing that they must be consistent in their methods rather than consistent in their goals. They think integrity means always using the same approach, but real integrity means always serving the same values while adapting your methods to be maximally effective. In your daily life, this might mean being the lion when someone is clearly attempting to manipulate or exploit you, confronting the behavior directly, and establishing clear boundaries. But it might mean being the fox when you're trying to influence someone who would react defensively to direct challenge, finding ways to help them reach the right conclusions through questions and strategic information rather than argument. The key insight is that moral weakness often disguises itself as moral consistency. People will tell you that changing your approach based on circumstances is unprincipled. But I learned that the truly unprincipled thing is to let your comfort with certain methods prevent you from achieving important goals. Master the lion when force serves justice. Master the fox when cunning serves truth. And master the wisdom to know which mode will be most effective in each situation you face. In my villa, hanging on the wall of my study, was a medieval tapestry depicting fortune as a wheel that raised men up and cast them down according to her whims. For months after my exile, I would stare at this image and feel the bitter taste of resignation. Like most people, I had been taught that fortune, luck, fate, circumstances beyond our control, was the dominant force in human affairs, and that virtue meant accepting whatever fortune brought with grace and patience. In the Medici garden stood an ancient sundial that became my teacher in one of the most subtle aspects of moral strength, the crucial relationship between virtue and timing. This sundial could only tell accurate time when the sun was shining at the right angle under the right conditions. It taught me that even the most virtuous actions become vicious when performed at the wrong moment, and even questionable tactics can serve virtue when employed with perfect timing. This insight revolutionized my understanding of moral decision-making. I had been taught to evaluate actions in isolation. Is this good or bad, right or wrong, virtuous or vicious? But I began to see that the moral value of any action depends heavily on when it's performed, under what circumstances, and in relation to what other events. The revelation came through observing a master diplomat negotiate a crucial treaty. Every word he spoke was technically true. Every promise he made was genuinely intended. Every concession he offered was fair. Yet the timing of his revelations, the sequence of his offers, and the pacing of his concessions created an outcome that served his interests far better than his counterparts. The same information presented in a different order or at different moments would have produced completely different results. I realized that what we call political skill or strategic thinking is often just moral timing, understanding when virtue serves virtue and when virtue serves vice. A harsh word spoken at the right moment can prevent a conflict that gentle words at the wrong moment would escalate. A generous gesture offered at the perfect time can create lasting loyalty, while the same gesture offered too early or too late can appear either suspicious or desperate. This principle applied dramatically to my own experience with the Florentine Republic. We often made the right decisions too late, or the wrong decisions too early. We would offer concessions after our negotiating position had already collapsed, making us appear weak rather than reasonable. We would take firm stands after everyone had already concluded we were irresolute, making us appear desperate rather than principled. The moral weakness of poor timing shows up everywhere once you learn to recognize it. It's having the right conversation with someone when they're not ready to hear it, ensuring that your truth-telling comes across as criticism rather than help. It's being generous when people expect generosity, so your kindness seems obligatory rather than meaningful. It's being firm when people expect firmness, so your strength seems routine rather than significant. I began to study the rhythm of human psychology and political dynamics. People are more receptive to certain messages at certain times. They're more likely to make concessions after experiencing consequences than before. They're more willing to accept difficult truths after they've been prepared for them than when they're surprised by them. The key insight is that moral timing requires reading the emotional and strategic context of every situation. The same action that builds trust in one context can destroy trust in another. The same words that inspire confidence at one moment can provoke resistance at another. Effective virtue requires not just choosing the right action, but choosing the right moment for that action. I learned to ask different questions before acting. Is this person ready to receive this message? Have the circumstances created an opening for this approach? Will my timing make my good intentions more effective or less effective? Am I acting now because it's the right time or because I'm impatient to act? This doesn't mean endless delay or perfectionist waiting for ideal conditions. Sometimes the moral choice is to act immediately, even under imperfect circumstances. But it does mean understanding that timing is not neutral. It's a crucial element of moral effectiveness that must be considered carefully. The practical application became clear through studying successful merchants and diplomats. They would prepare multiple approaches for different scenarios, but they would choose which approach to use based on reading the specific moment they found themselves in. They understood that being right at the wrong time is often worse than being slightly wrong at the right time. In relationships, this means understanding when someone is open to feedback and when they're defensive, when they need support and when they need space, when they're ready for difficult conversations, and when they need time to process. In leadership, it means knowing when to push for change and when to consolidate gains, when to be demanding and when to be patient. The moral strength of perfect timing lies in its service to effectiveness rather than convenience. You're not waiting for the right moment because you're afraid to act. You're choosing the right moment because you want your action to achieve its intended purpose. You're not rushing to act because you're impatient. You're acting promptly when circumstances create optimal conditions for success. The sundial taught me that accuracy requires alignment between intention and circumstance, between principle and context, between what you want to accomplish and when conditions will best support that accomplishment. Moral timing is the art of making that alignment serve justice rather than just convenience. Among my papers from those dark years were anonymous letters threatening my life, crude notes slipped under my door by people who hated me for ideas. I had written for truths I had spoken, for positions I had taken that challenged their comfortable assumptions. These death threats became my teachers in perhaps the most difficult aspect of moral strength, the courage to be hated by people whose opinion shouldn't matter in service of principles that should matter. At first, receiving these threats terrified me. Like most people, I had been conditioned to believe that being disliked was evidence of moral failure. If people hated me, I must be doing something wrong. If my ideas provoked anger, I must be expressing them poorly. If my positions created enemies, I must be taking the wrong positions. This belief nearly destroyed my ability to think clearly or act effectively. The breakthrough came when I began to analyze who was sending these threats and why. They weren't coming from people whose judgment I respected or whose interests aligned with justice. They were coming from those who benefited from the illusions I was challenging, who profited from the weaknesses I was exposing, who felt threatened by the truths I was revealing. Their hatred wasn't evidence that I was wrong. It was evidence that I was effective. I realized that the need to be liked by everyone is one of the most paralyzing forms of moral weakness, because it makes you hostage to the approval of people who may have every reason to want you to fail. When you cannot bear to be disliked, you cannot take positions that threaten anyone's interests, challenge anyone's assumptions, or demand anyone's improvement. You become trapped in a prison of universal approval that renders you universally irrelevant. This insight transformed my understanding of moral courage. I had thought courage meant doing the right thing despite personal risk, but I learned that it often means doing the right thing despite social risk, being willing to be misunderstood, criticized, attacked, and hated by people who prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths. The moral strength of tolerating hatred lies in discriminating between whose approval matters and whose doesn't. When someone hates you for standing up to their bullying, their hatred is a badge of honor. When someone dislikes you for refusing to enable their self-destructive behavior, their disapproval confirms that you're helping them whether they realize it or not. When someone attacks you for challenging systems that benefit them at others' expense, their hostility proves that your challenge is effective. I began to see that many of the people I had tried hardest to please were precisely the people whose disapproval would actually indicate that I was doing good work. The corrupt officials who wanted me to be less critical of corruption. The ineffective leaders who wanted me to be less demanding of effectiveness. The comfortable citizens who wanted me to stop pointing out uncomfortable realities. This doesn't mean seeking hatred for its own sake or taking pride in being difficult. It means understanding that if you're never hated by anyone, you're probably not standing for anything important enough to threaten anyone's interests. It means recognizing that universal approval is usually a sign of universal irrelevance. The practical application requires developing what I call selective sensitivity, caring deeply about the opinions of people whose judgment serves justice, while becoming immune to the opinions of people whose judgment serves only their own comfort or advantage. This is not about becoming callous or arrogant. It's about becoming strategically responsive to feedback that helps you improve while ignoring feedback that just wants to disable you. In my own life, I learned to ask different questions when facing criticism or hostility. Is this person's disapproval evidence that I'm harming something good or that I'm threatening something bad? Would pleasing this person require me to compromise principles that matter more than their approval? Is their hatred directed at my methods, which I might improve, or at my goals, which I should maintain? The loneliness that comes with moral strength is real and difficult. When you're willing to be hated for important principles, you will sometimes find yourself isolated from people who preferred your less challenging previous self. But this loneliness is the price of integrity, and it's temporary. Eventually, you attract people who respect your willingness to stand for something meaningful, even when standing is difficult. The key insight is that being hated by the right people for the right reasons is often a sign that you're becoming a person of substance rather than just a person of style. The death threats I received weren't evidence that I was becoming evil. They were evidence that I was becoming inconvenient to evil. This strength applies to every situation where doing the right thing will make someone angry. Setting boundaries with people who benefit from your lack of boundaries, holding people accountable when they prefer to avoid accountability, speaking truths that challenge profitable lies, refusing to participate in systems that serve some people at others' expense. The test is simple. Whose hatred would actually be a compliment? Whose disapproval would indicate that you're moving in the right direction? Whose anger would suggest that you're threatening something that deserves to be threatened? Focus on earning the respect of people whose respect is worth having, and let the hatred of people whose hatred is meaningless fall where it may. In my collection of documents from Renaissance Italy, Few disgusted me more than the indulgence papers sold by corrupt church officials, elaborate certificates promising forgiveness for sins in exchange for money. These papers represented the most insidious form of moral weakness I encountered, virtue that had been corrupted into performance, goodness that served appearance rather than substance, righteousness that enabled the very evils it claimed to oppose. These indulgences taught me to recognize what I came to call false virtue, actions that look virtuous on the surface but actually serve vice, people who appear moral but actually enable immorality, systems that claim to promote good but actually protect evil. Learning to identify and destroy false virtue became essential to developing real moral strength because false virtue is one of the greatest obstacles to genuine moral progress. The revelation came when I studied how these indulgences actually functioned in society. Wealthy sinners could purchase forgiveness while poor, honest people struggled with genuine guilt. The system that claimed to promote repentance actually discouraged it by making salvation a commercial transaction rather than a spiritual transformation. The institution that presented itself as the guardian of morality had become a marketplace for moral exemptions. This pattern existed everywhere once I learned to see it. I observed nobles who performed elaborate public acts of charity while systematically exploiting their tenants. I watched politicians who gave beautiful speeches about justice while consistently serving unjust interests. I encountered merchants who displayed religious symbols prominently while engaging in fraud that would make pagans blush. The moral weakness of false virtue is more dangerous than obvious vice because it disguises itself as moral strength. When someone is obviously corrupt, you can recognize and resist their influence. But when someone appears virtuous while serving corrupt purposes, they can manipulate your own moral instincts against you. They can make you feel guilty for questioning their methods because their stated intentions seem pure. I began to understand that false virtue serves several functions for those who practice it. First, it provides moral cover for immoral actions, allowing people to feel righteous while behaving badly. Second, it creates confusion about what real virtue looks like, making it harder for others to recognize and practice genuine morality. Third, it exhausts moral energy that could be directed toward actual improvement. The key insight is that false virtue can only be identified by examining results rather than intentions, outcomes rather than appearances, long-term effects rather than immediate impressions. True virtue creates justice, reduces suffering, and enables human flourishing. False virtue may claim these same goals, but it actually produces injustice, increases suffering, and prevents flourishing. In my diplomatic work, I learned to recognize the signs of false virtue in negotiations. Partners who emphasized their honesty constantly were usually preparing to lie. Allies who proclaimed their loyalty most loudly were often planning betrayal. Leaders who spoke most passionately about their people's welfare were frequently the ones exploiting those people most systematically. This taught me to develop what I call virtue verification, the practice of evaluating moral claims based on their actual effects rather than their stated intentions. When someone claims to be helping, ask who actually benefits from their help. When someone claims to be serving justice, examine what kind of justice does their service actually produce. When someone claims to be promoting virtue, investigate what kind of behavior does their promotion actually encourage. The practical application requires the courage to challenge virtue signaling in yourself and others. This means asking uncomfortable questions about whether your own moral actions serve their stated purposes or just make you feel good about yourself. It means being willing to criticize approaches that look virtuous but produce bad results. It means prioritizing effective good over performative good. In modern contexts, false virtue appears as activism that serves the activist's ego more than the stated cause. It shows up as charity that makes the giver feel generous while keeping Recipients-dependent. It manifests as policies that sound compassionate but create the problems they claim to solve. It emerges as leadership that talks beautifully about values while systematically violating those values. The moral strength required to destroy false virtue lies in preferring difficult truth to comfortable lies, even when those lies are dressed up as moral principles. This means being willing to admit when your own virtuous actions aren't actually serving virtuous purposes. It means challenging systems that claim moral authority but produce immoral results. It means supporting approaches that work over approaches that feel good. The test for distinguishing true virtue from false virtue is simple but demanding. Look at the actual results over time. Does this approach actually reduce suffering, or just appear to care about suffering? Does this policy actually promote justice, or just claim to value justice? Does this behavior actually serve others, or just serve the person's need to feel virtuous? True virtue is often less dramatic, less visible, less celebrated than false virtue. It works quietly, measures success by outcomes rather than applause, and cares more about being effective than being recognized. False virtue is often louder, more visible, more praised, and less effective at accomplishing the good it claims to serve. Your responsibility is to choose true virtue, even when it's less comfortable, less popular, and less immediately rewarding than false virtue. The indulgence papers promised easy forgiveness, but they prevented real redemption. False virtue promises easy righteousness, but it prevents real moral strength. Among the most tragic documents in my possession were unfinished fortification, plans from various Italian cities, military blueprints showing walls that were never completed, defenses that were never fully implemented, preparations that were abandoned halfway through construction. These incomplete fortifications taught me one of the most costly forms of moral weakness, the tendency to commit partially to necessary actions, ensuring that you get neither the benefits of decisive action nor the safety of avoiding action altogether. The pattern was always the same. A city would recognize a threat, begin building defenses, then lose enthusiasm for the project when the immediate danger seemed to pass or when the costs became uncomfortable. They would leave walls half-built, gates partially reinforced, preparations incomplete. When the real attack came, these half measures often made their situation worse than if they had never started building at all, because they had a false sense of security that led to poor strategic decisions. This taught me that in many situations, half commitment is more dangerous than no commitment at all. When you undertake something important but refuse to see it through completely, you often create new vulnerabilities while failing to achieve the benefits you were seeking. You invest enough to create risk, but not enough to manage that risk effectively. Observe this pattern constantly in political and personal relationships. Leaders would begin reforms, but abandon them when they encountered resistance, creating chaos without achieving improvement. Diplomats would start negotiations but withdraw when discussions became difficult, creating hostility without reaching resolution. Individuals would begin difficult conversations but avoid the hard parts, creating confusion without solving problems. The moral weakness of half measures stems from wanting the benefits of bold action without accepting the costs and responsibilities that come with those benefits. It's the desire to appear decisive while remaining comfortable, to seem committed while maintaining escape routes, to look strong while avoiding the challenges that real strength requires. In my own diplomatic career, I had fallen into this trap repeatedly. I would begin frank discussions with foreign representatives but pull back when the conversation became uncomfortable, ensuring that I neither maintained the polite fiction of diplomatic courtesy nor achieved the clarity that honest communication could provide. I would start to implement new policies but retreat when they proved unpopular, creating enough disruption to anger people without achieving enough change to solve the underlying problems. The key insight is that many important actions are only beneficial if they're completed fully. A bridge that's halfway built is not half as useful as a complete bridge. It's completely useless and potentially dangerous. A confrontation that's half completed often makes relationships worse, rather, than better. A reform that's half implemented usually creates more problems than it solves. This principle applies to every area of life where significant change or commitment is required. In relationships, it means that if you're going to address a serious issue, you must be prepared to work through all the complications that discussion will create. You can't start a difficult conversation and then abandon it when it becomes uncomfortable. That usually makes things worse than saying nothing at all. In leadership, it means that if you're going to challenge someone's performance or behavior, you must be prepared to follow through with consequences if talking doesn't work. Setting expectations without enforcing them often undermines your authority more than having no expectations would. In personal development, it means that if you're going to change significant patterns in your life, you must commit to working through the resistance, discomfort, and setbacks that real change always involves. Starting transformation projects that you abandon halfway through often leaves you worse off than never starting at all. The moral strength required to avoid half measures is the courage to count the full cost before beginning, and the persistence to pay that full cost once you've started. This doesn't mean being reckless or overcommitting to every impulse. It means being realistic about what complete commitment will require and being honest about whether you're prepared to provide that commitment. The practical application requires developing what I call completion consciousness, the habit of thinking through entire processes rather than just first steps. Before beginning any important action, ask yourself, what will it take to see this through completely? Am I prepared to handle the resistance, complications, and costs that full implementation will require? What would happen if I started this, but didn't finish it? Sometimes this analysis will lead you to decide not to start something, and that's often the wiser choice. Better to maintain the status quo honestly than to create disruption without achieving improvement. But when you do decide to act, commit to completion rather than hoping you can get the benefits of action without paying its full price. The test is simple. Are you willing to accept all the consequences of the action you're contemplating, or are you hoping to get only the benefits? Are you prepared to handle the full process of change, or are you just excited about the idea of starting something new? Are you committed to achieving the goal, or just attached to feeling like you're pursuing the goal? The unfinished fortifications served as constant reminders that partial commitment to necessary actions often creates more vulnerability than no commitment at all. Half measures are the enemy of both safety and progress. During my years of exile, when I had lost all external power and authority, I began drafting what I called my constitutional framework for personal governance, a document outlining how an individual could create internal systems for moral strength that would function regardless of external circumstances. This exercise taught me that removing moral weakness requires more than just understanding principles. It requires building systematic approaches to implementing those principles consistently over time. The insight came from observing how the most stable governments succeeded not through the virtue of individual leaders, but through institutional structures that channeled human nature productively rather than fighting against it. The Roman Republic had lasted for centuries, not because Romans were inherently more virtuous than other peoples, but because they had created systems that made virtue more rewarding than vice, that made strategic thinking more profitable than short-term thinking. I realized that individuals needed similar internal structures, personal institutions that would support moral strength even when emotions, pressures, or circumstances pushed toward moral weakness. Just as a well-designed republic could produce good governance even with imperfect leaders, a well-designed personal system could produce moral strength even during moments of weakness, confusion, or temptation. The first element of this personal republic is what I call constitutional principles, a small number of core commitments that remain constant regardless of changing circumstances. These aren't detailed rules about specific behaviors, but fundamental orientations that guide decision-making when situations become complex or pressured. For myself, I identified 3 constitutional principles: effectiveness over comfort, results over intentions, and strategic thinking over emotional reaction. These principles didn't tell me exactly what to do in every situation, but they provided a framework for evaluating options and making decisions that served my larger purposes rather than my immediate impulses. The second element is institutional. Checks and balances, systems for preventing any single emotion, desire, or pressure from dominating decision-making without appropriate consideration of alternatives. Just as good governments prevent any single faction from wielding unchecked power, good personal systems prevent any single impulse from controlling behavior without oversight. I developed practices for creating internal checks and balances. Before making important decisions, I would write arguments for different approaches, as if I were representing different interests in a debate. When I felt strong emotions about a situation, I would wait and reconsider after those emotions had subsided. When I was tempted to act impulsively, I would consult my constitutional principles to see whether immediate action served my larger goals. The third element is systematic review and adjustment, regular processes for evaluating whether your personal systems are working effectively and making improvements when they're not. Successful republics adapt their institutions as circumstances change, and successful individuals must do the same with their personal systems. I established monthly reviews where I would examine my decisions from the previous period, identify patterns where I had acted from strength versus weakness, and adjust my systems to better support effective choices. This wasn't about judging myself harshly for mistakes, but about learning from experience to improve future performance. The fourth element is strategic resource allocation, understanding that your time, energy, and attention are limited resources that must be invested strategically rather than spent randomly. Just as good governments allocate their resources to maximize security and prosperity, individuals must allocate their personal resources to maximize effectiveness and moral strength. This meant learning to say no to demands on my time that didn't serve important purposes, even when saying no felt uncomfortable. It meant investing energy in developing capabilities that would serve long-term goals rather than just immediate pleasures. It meant choosing where to focus attention based on impact rather than just interest or urgency. The fifth element is alliance and opposition management, systematic approaches to building relationships with people who support your goals and managing relationships with people who oppose them. Successful republics maintain networks of allies while neutralizing threats, and individuals must do similar work in their personal and professional relationships. Learn to identify which people in my life supported my development of moral strength and to invest more time and energy in those relationships. I also learned to recognize which people benefited from my moral weakness and to limit their influence on my decisions even when those people were otherwise likable or important. The practical implementation of your personal republic requires treating yourself as both the citizen and the government of your own life. As a citizen, you have desires, emotions, and impulses that are natural and legitimate. As the government, you have the responsibility to channel those forces productively rather than being controlled by them. This means creating systems that work with your human nature rather than against it. If you know you make poor decisions when hungry or tired, build systems that ensure important decisions happen when you're well-fed and rested. If you know you're tempted by certain behaviors that undermine your goals, create systems that make those behaviors less convenient and better behaviors more convenient. Your personal republic should be designed to make moral strength easier and moral weakness harder, not through willpower alone, but through intelligent systems that stack conditions in favor of your better choices. In what I believed might be my final letter, written during an illness that I thought would kill me, I addressed future generations about the responsibility that comes with understanding the principles I had discovered. This letter, which I never sent but kept among my most private papers, explored a question that had haunted me. If moral weakness enables evil to flourish, then developing moral strength becomes not just a personal benefit, but a moral obligation. To everyone whose lives you might influence, the insight that changed everything was recognizing that moral weakness is not a private vice, it's a public problem. When you fail to develop the moral strength to be effective in your sphere of influence, you don't just harm yourself. You leave space for less principled people to fill the roles that you could have filled. You fail to provide the leadership, guidance, or resistance that your community needs from you. I had seen this pattern throughout Italian politics. Good people who withdrew from public life because they didn't want to get their hands dirty with political realities. Principled individuals who refused to compete for positions of influence because competition felt morally uncomfortable, virtuous. Citizens who avoided responsibility because responsibility required making difficult decisions that might be criticized. The result was that important positions were filled by people who had no such qualms about moral complexity, often people who lacked the principled foundation that would guide them to use power responsibly. The good people's moral purity had become a gift to those who would abuse the power that principled people refused to seek or wield effectively. This taught me that developing moral strength is not about becoming ruthless or abandoning ethics. It's about becoming capable of serving ethical purposes in a world where ethical purposes often require sophisticated strategy to achieve. It's about refusing to let your desire for moral comfort prevent you from taking responsibility for moral outcomes. The legacy of principled power lies in its multiplication effect. When you develop the moral strength to be effective in your responsibilities, you create space for other principled people to be effective in theirs. When you demonstrate that virtue and effectiveness can be combined, you provide a model that others can follow. When you achieve good results through principled methods, you prove that moral strength is practical rather than just idealistic. In my diplomatic work, I had discovered that other principled people were more likely to work with me effectively when they saw that my principles made me a more reliable partner, not a less capable one. When they understood that my strategic thinking served consistent values rather than shifting conveniences, they trusted me with greater responsibilities and more sensitive negotiations. This created an upward spiral. As I became more effective, through moral strength, I attracted opportunities to work with other effective and principled people. As I demonstrated that strategic thinking could serve ethical purposes, others felt permission to develop their own strategic capabilities without feeling like they were compromising their values. The responsibility that comes with this knowledge is substantial. Once you understand how to combine principle with effectiveness, you cannot claim ignorance when you choose comfort over competence. You cannot pretend that your moral weakness is just a personal failing that affects only you. You become accountable for the leadership you could provide, the problems you could solve, the positive influence you could have if you chose to develop the capabilities required for those contributions. This doesn't mean you must become a political leader or take on massive public responsibilities. It means you must develop the moral strength to fulfill whatever responsibilities you do have as a parent, employee, friend, citizen, community member, in ways that actually serve the people and purposes you claim to care about. The practicals. Application requires thinking beyond your immediate comfort to consider your larger impact. When you avoid difficult conversations that could improve your team's performance, you're not just protecting yourself from discomfort, you're failing to provide the leadership your team needs. When you refuse to set boundaries with someone whose behavior affects others, you're not just avoiding conflict, you're enabling harm to continue. When you choose ineffective virtue over effective virtue, you're not just maintaining your moral purity. You're ceding influence to people who may not share your values. Every position you don't compete for, every responsibility you don't accept, every difficult decision you don't make creates a vacuum that someone else will fill. The multiplication effect also works in reverse. When principled people develop moral strength and begin achieving good results through effective methods, they inspire others to do the same. They prove that you don't have to choose between being good and being effective. They demonstrate that strategic thinking can serve virtue rather than replacing it. Your legacy of principled power will be measured not just by what you accomplish directly, but by how your example influences others to develop their own moral strength. When people see you combining genuine virtue with genuine effectiveness, they begin to believe that such combination is possible for them as well. The question that haunts me still is this: how many problems could be solved? How much suffering could be prevented? How much good could be accomplished if more principled people develop the moral strength to be effective rather than just pure? Your answer to that question will determine whether you see developing moral strength as an optional personal improvement or as an urgent moral obligation. The letter I never sent concluded with this challenge: the world needs principled people who are also effective people. It needs virtue that can achieve virtuous outcomes, not just virtue that can feel virtuous about its intentions. It needs you to become dangerous to evil and useful to good. On my desk, as I write these final words, sits a blank piece of parchment and a newly sharpened quill, tools for writing the next chapter of any story, symbols of the choice that every person faces when they understand the difference between moral weakness and moral strength. You now possess the same knowledge that took me years of exile, study, and painful experience to develop. The question is not whether you understand these principles, but whether you will use them to transform yourself and your influence on the world. The transformation from moral weakness to moral strength is not a comfortable process. It requires abandoning the safety of simple rules for the complexity of strategic thinking. It demands giving up the luxury of feeling pure for the responsibility of being effective. It means accepting that moral strength often looks different from moral posturing, and that serving good purposes sometimes requires methods that make idealistic people uncomfortable, but this discomfort is the price of real influence rather than merely symbolic virtue. Every person who has ever made a significant positive difference in the world has had to navigate this same transformation. They had to choose between feeling virtuous and being useful, between maintaining their comfort and fulfilling their potential, between moral weakness disguised as purity and moral strength disguised as complexity. Your first step must be honest self-examination. Identify the patterns of moral weakness in your own life, the places where you choose comfort over effectiveness, where you prioritize your reputation for goodness over your actual impact on good outcomes, where you let perfect become the enemy of better. These patterns are not character flaws to be ashamed of. They are strategic vulnerabilities to be addressed systematically. Begin by selecting one area where your moral weakness is limiting your effectiveness. Perhaps it's avoiding difficult conversations that could improve important relationships. Perhaps it's failing to set boundaries with people whose behavior affects others. Perhaps it's refusing to compete for positions where you could make positive contributions because competition feels morally uncomfortable. Apply the principles I have shared to this specific situation. Practice being both lion and fox as circumstances require. Develop tolerance for being disliked by people whose approval would require you to enable what you oppose. Create internal systems that support moral strength rather than relying on willpower. Alone, most importantly, measure your progress by results rather than intentions. Are the people you care about better off because of your actions? Are the problems you want to solve actually being addressed? Are the values you claim to support being advanced through your choices? If your moral purity is not producing moral outcomes, then your purity has become a form of selfishness. The daily practice of moral strength requires constant vigilance against the temptation to retreat into comfortable weakness. Every day, willy, present opportunities to choose effectiveness over comfort, strategic thinking over emotional reaction, long-term good over short-term convenience. These choices will often be small, but their cumulative effect will determine whether you become a person of substance or merely a person of style. Remember that moral strength is not about becoming harsh, manipulative, or unprincipled. It is about becoming capable of serving your principles effectively in a complex world. It is about refusing to let your desire for moral comfort prevent you from accepting moral responsibility. It is about caring more about achieving good outcomes than about feeling good about your methods. The Renaissance was called a rebirth because it represented humanity's emergence from a period of intellectual and moral stagnation into an era of renewed creativity, discovery, and achievement. Your personal renaissance begins when you emerge from the stagnation of moral weakness into the achievement of moral strength. This transformation will not make you perfect, but it will make you effective. It will not eliminate moral complexity from your life, but it will give you tools for navigating that complexity successfully. It will not guarantee that everyone will approve of your choices, but it will ensure that your choices serve purposes worthy of disapproval from those who prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths. The blank parchment waits for your story. The quill is sharp and ready. The principles you need have been laid before you. The only question remaining is whether you will use these tools to write a story of moral weakness that feels comfortable, or a story of moral strength that achieves something worthy of the struggles it will require. Your renaissance begins now with your next decision, in your next interaction, through your next choice between what feels virtuous and what serves virtue. The world is waiting to see whether you will join the ranks of those who understand that true morality requires not just good intentions, but the strength, wisdom, and courage to make those intentions effective in the real world. Write well. The future is watching.